All right, back. Welcome to lesson number 2, where in lesson number 1 we talked about the focus on the law of Moses and how there really isn't a whole lot of references to the other books of the Old Testament. Now, that doesn't mean that those other books were not important, but clearly, as you look at the written word of the Old Testament, the Israelites focused mostly on the law of Moses. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the copying of the Old Testament, and we're going to deal with 2 questions that we're going to deal with in the next page. But I want to create a scenario for you to kind of put things in perspective. Again, our ultimate goal is to learn, the Old Testament that we have in our English Bibles today. Where does that come from? What was used to bring about that copy of the Old Testament in English? So here's the scenario to put things in perspective I want to give to you. Number 1, I want to put us in a period of time like, let's say 1940. We're living in 1940, and we want to make our own handwritten copy of the Old Testament, just for fun. So how are we going to do that? Well, obviously we need to have copies, good copies of the Old Testament that we can compare and contrast and use that to figure out what is going to be our copy. What are we going to write down as our passages for the Old Testament? So this lesson is all about the copies, trying to find copies. When did those copies come into existence? In 1940, what would we have at our disposal that we could use for making our own copy of the Old Testament? So one of the questions we want to deal with in this lesson is, when did they begin to copy the Old Testament? In other words, what evidence do we have that, okay, at this point they started making copies, written copies of the Old Testament? Now, we already saw in lesson number 1 that they were commanded to make some copies. For example, the king was commanded to make a copy and to read it and study it and to keep the law of God in front of him at all times. We talked about the copy that was to be made on those limestones next to the mountains of cursing and blessing. But those are not in existence. Those did not survive. And so even if the kings did make a copy, which I highly doubt that most did, they're not in existence today. So that will not help us in trying to find a copy to make our copy. But that's one of the things we're going to be dealing with. When exactly is the evidence that they started making physical copies of the Old Testament? And then, to help us with that, question number 2, what is the oldest extant copy of the Old Testament? In other words, in 1940, what is the oldest copy, a physical copy that we could get to, that we could get on our hands, that we could use to make a copy? Now, that may not be the exact answer for question number 1, but it definitely would help us in answering question number 1. It would give us evidence that at least by this date and time, we see that they started making copies of the Old Testament. So, in my research, the oldest extant copy of the Old Testament are a couple of scrolls known as the Ketif Hinnom scrolls. And this is what they look like. If you were to go see them today, they're very small. This is how they are displayed. And they're actually copies of the Old Testament, fragmentary copies made out of copper. So this is a copper material you're looking at. So again, there's just two of them, and they're partial copies, very small copies of the book of Numbers. And in particular, they are copies of Numbers chapter 6, verse 24, 25, and 26. And I think as you look at this, you can see that obviously there was a lot more to this copper copy, say that 10 times fast, than what you have here. But it didn't survive. Only these two fragments survived and were found. Now remember, we're looking for copies to help us in 1940, and these would not be them. These scrolls were actually not found until 1979. And today they're housed in Jerusalem in the Israeli Museum. And we will go to this Israeli museum somewhere in this series and talk a little bit about what could be found, what can be seen in that great museum in Jerusalem. But for 1940, these would not have been known. They had not been found at that point. And even if they were, it wouldn't help us that much because it's just a fragmentary copy of 3 verses in the book of Numbers. So these date to the 7th century BC, the 600s BC. And to put that in a biblical timeline, this would be around the time, the later years of King Manasseh or the beginning years of King Josiah. So that kind of gives you that date and time. And so this is the oldest extant copy, physical copy, fragmentary copy we have of the Old Testament. Now, Mallory Challis says, or writes, it is possible that Hebrew literature existed in some form well before 700 BC, but we just don't have those physical documents. So again, don't think that this is the exact time when they started making copies of the Old Testament. Probably, seems most likely, they did make copies prior to this, maybe long before this, but again, they did survive. We have no evidence of their existence. So these are the oldest, most ancient, physical, extant copies of the Old Testament, the Ketif Hinnom scrolls, 600s BC. Now, the next one that we're going to look at, the second oldest, we're going to see a long time span between the Hinnom scrolls, the Ketif scrolls, and this next one. There's a period of what we might say silence when it comes to finding these copies, these physical copies. We just don't have any for around the next 500 years. So we go from the oldest in the 7th century BC to the next one. And this is a copy, a partial copy, referred to as the Nash Papyrus. Now let me pause here for just a moment. We're talking about Old Testament time period, and this is just from my research, my study. If you're watching this and you say, oh, you missed something, there is other copies that you didn't include in this, please let me know. Please contact me, let me know. I'll do the research. Again, this is just from what I was able to find, and if I'm missing something, I would really appreciate you letting me know so I can add it to this series of lessons. So the Nash Papyrus is actually 4 papyrus fragments that were found in Egypt in 1902. And so this is a picture of them. And I'm not exactly sure where the fragments, this might be one fragment, this might be 2, this might be 3, and then a little fourth attachment here. I'm not sure how that all breaks up, but this is a picture of all 4 put together in order. Now notice these are found in 1902. So if we had the resources in 1940, yes, this could be a help to us. This would be in existence and could be used in making our copy. But how much help would it be? Well, not a whole lot, because what the Nash Papyrus is, it's a copy of the 10 Commandments, and that's it, as far as the biblical books go. And included is a Jewish prayer. So it wouldn't be a whole lot of help other than giving us a very old copy of the 10 Commandments. And so scholars believe that this might have been used in daily worship by Egyptian Jews of that time period. And what is the time period? Well, the Nash Papyrus, and this is how it looks in its presentation form if you were to see it. Where could you see it? Well, there's a little bit of debate. I believe it's at the Cambridge University, but I did find some evidence that it was, at least for a period of time, at BYU, and that could be that sometimes these things travel around to different museums, and that might be why I found evidence of BYU. But the majority of the evidence I found is that it's housed usually in Cambridge University. And the writing of the Nash Papyrus dates to the 2nd century BC, about 150 to 100 BC. So you can see that's a long span of time from the Genome scrolls to the Nash Papyrus, about 500 years, where we don't have anything that we've found at this point in existence that would be considered a copy of the Old Testament. So this is, as far as I have found, the second oldest extant copy, and it's just a partial copy of the 10 Commandments. Now, almost around the same period of time, as far as their writing, we find fragmentary copies which come to be known as the Cairo-Geniza fragments. And so where were these found? Well, you can kind of tell in the title there. They were found in Cairo, Egypt. In fact, they were found in an old synagogue called the Ben Ezra Synagogue, in the actual storeroom located in what's called Old Cairo. And we'll talk a little bit about this, but let me just quickly say that the way that Jews would handle scrolls in the synagogue is that when they started getting old and deteriorated, they wouldn't just throw them away. They would store them. And apparently what we're seeing is fragments of stored scrolls from this synagogue in the storeroom of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And what we discovered is that some of these fragments, not all of them, but some of these fragments are the Old Testament. They are fragments of the Old Testament written in the Hebrew language. So that's quite the discovery. But again, nothing in existence of a whole copy of the Old Testament. And so these are various parts of the Old Testament, again, dating around the same time as the Nash Papyrus, dating the 2nd century BC. And these are located in various museums and universities. Since there's so many of them, they were just kind of passed out among lots of different places. And if you ever wanted to see if there was one around your area, if you were traveling, you could just go online and find where these are located, if there's one close to you. So as I said, these are only fragments. And these are dated around the 2nd century BC, but look, they were not found until much later. Some in 1896, some in 1902, some later in 1979, as far as I found. So some of these would be in existence in 1940. Some of these would be able to be used. But again, as I said, they would not be much help making a copy prior to the 1970s. And they're only fragmentary. So as we take a look, as far as, again, that I have found, these are the only 3 ancient copies of the Old Testament in existence. They're all fragmentary. And so as we're trying to sit here in 1940 to make a copy, our own copy of the Old Testament, we're really not finding a whole lot to use. And that's kind of the fascination of the story of how we got the Old Testament. So let's take a pause here from finding copies of the Old Testament, and let's talk a little bit about evidence for making copies, even if this doesn't produce a physical copy. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the scribe, the role of the scribes. Because when we talk about copying of the Bible, most often we think of that being done by scribes. So when you go to the Old Testament and you look for the word scribe, the first appearance of scribes in the time in the Bible is the time of the kings. Starts with the United Kingdom and then also carries on into the divided kingdom. Now, the very first scribes appear to be very important, especially to the ruling class, to kings and to rulers. And a big part of that is, remember that a large portion of society in ancient times were illiterate. They did not read, they did not write. And so that might, I don't know if that would include the kings, maybe some kings, but if a king could not read or write, well, you can imagine having scribes that could write down the history of your reign, to record important events and so forth. And that's what we see these scribes early on being used for. Not so much copying the Old Testament, but maybe they did that as well. But they were kind of the official king's scribe to record this and that and to write this and that, all within the reign of that king. So we're going to divide up our study into the scribes in pre-captivity versus captivity and post-captivity. The first appearance of scribe in the days of the kings comes from 2 Samuel 20, verse 23 through 25. And this is a list of King David. So this is in King David's period of time. This is a list of King David's, what we might call his official kingly cabinet, right? His staff. Now, Joab was over the whole army of Israel, and Benaiah was the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and Adoram was over the forced labor, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Heled, was the recorder, and Sheva was scribe. So notice David and his cabinet actually had the position of a scribe, and his name was Sheva. And what seems to be closely related to that as well is that there was a recorder also. I'm not exactly sure the difference between the recorder and the scribe, but again, notice the use of kings and using scribes. In 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 10, we read of scribes again. And when they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest came up and tied it in bags and counted the money which was found in the house of the Lord. This is a story where the contributions, the tithing of the Israelites is gathered up, and it's just a bunch of money laying around in the temple. And so the high priest calls the king's scribe, and together they count it, they record it, and they bag it up, tie it up. And that really kind of gives you a sense of the work of a king's scribe. Again, not exactly what we would expect as far as what we're looking for of a scribe making a copy of the Old Testament. Again, not saying that that's not being done at this period of time. We're just looking for concrete evidence that that's what's going on. But when we get to a passage in 1 Chronicles 24, now we start to see maybe what we're looking for. Not only do we have scribes, but we have scribes that are linked to the tribe of Levi. And this is where the priests come from, the servants at the temple, the servants of God. And this might be a lot closer to this evidence of scribes doing the work of copying the Old Testament. And so in 1 Chronicles 24, verse 5 and 6, we read, "And thus they were divided by lot," that's the Levites, "the one as the other, for they were officers of the sanctuary and officers of God, both from the descendants of Eleazar and the descendants of Ithamar." Those are two high priestly families. And notice this, "And Shemaiah, the son of Nathaniel, the scribe from the Levites. He recorded them in the presence of the king." And you could go on from that. But now we start to see Levitical scribes coming from Levi. And that might be more in tune with, because these were what? These were God's servants of the temple. This might be evidence of scribes that are now doing that function. Again, not saying it didn't happen before this, but this is some evidence, really concrete evidence. Maybe these are the scribes that begin copying that Old Testament. So now let's talk about when Israel went into captivity. They weren't in the promised land. And then when they return after the captivity. In Jeremiah 36, verse 4, we encounter one of the most recognized, one of the most famous scribes, Jeremiah's scribe. And we read in verse 4, "Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah. And Baruch wrote at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord, which he had spoken to him on a scroll." Now this is a little different because Baruch is not making a copy of some book in the Old Testament. Baruch is actually making the book of Jeremiah. God is speaking to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is giving it to Baruch, who is writing it down. And this is like one of the clearest examples, evidence we have in the Old Testament of how, at least in the time of the prophets, the time of Jeremiah, how this biblical book became recorded. I want to read a little insert from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, the ISBE. Talking about Baruch, the ISBE says, "A scribe of the exilic period," that's the period of exile, "who deserves mention is Baruch, Jeremiah's secretary. Baruch is not identified as a Torah scholar," and that's the term we're looking for, right? We're looking for the one that copies the law. "He is instead a scribe in the earlier sense of the word. He takes down the prophet's dictation. He reads the words as Jeremiah's representative, and he collects and preserves these words." And you can see the verses that show all of this. "This points to the probability that one of the important early tasks of the scribes was the custody and transmission of Israel's written scriptures. This work was indispensable to the gradual emergence and a distinct group of writings that came to be regarded as canonical. And so you can see by reading that, we are really having concrete evidence that not only how Jeremiah and maybe even Lamentations is written, but how copies of the Old Testament were made. Well, in Ezra chapter 7, verse 3, we learn of another well-known scribe, and of course, that is Ezra himself. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to practice it, and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. Of course, that's God's statutes and God's ordinances. So Ezra becomes a very, very well-known scribe. And in Nehemiah chapter 8, 1 through 3, we have this account of Ezra actually building or using a podium and putting the scrolls of the law, which clearly shows there was a copy of it, and reads it out loud to all the people as the people rejoice. One of the great events in the returning to the land of Canaan. Nehemiah 8, 1 through 3. Now again, turning to the ISBE to read about Ezra, we read the key figure of the early post-exilic period is the paradigmatic scribe Ezra. Although Ezra is also a priest, it is in his role as a scribe that he reestablishes the centrality of the law for the people of Israel. When he's first introduced in the book of Ezra, it is as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, and learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. He is responsible not only for the reading of the Torah to the people, but also for its study. The special province of the scribe. For these reasons, Ezra stands as, and I'm not sure what that word is, I'm blocking it, the emerging class of scribes as Torah scholars. And this is really what we're looking at, this evidence of these scribes now being used to make copies of the Old Testament. But here's the problem. I think it's good evidence. I think it just goes to reason that the law was so important. The Old Testament was so important to the Israelites, to the Jews, that yes, they would make copies. But we don't have any of these copies in existence. They didn't survive. And so as we're standing here in 1940 looking for copies of the Old Testament to make our own copy, we're not really finding a whole lot in existence. But I think there's enough there that we know at least throughout the years, Israel continued to make copies of the law and the entirety of the Old Testament. We're going to stop here for today. And if you like these lessons, we hope that you'll continue to watch them and learn from them. If you're in the Central Florida area, we'd love for you to come and worship with us. Here's all of our information, our address, our website, our Facebook page, our YouTube page. If you're watching this, you've discovered us on one of these, and you can find our order of service. You can find all the information about the church. But in next lesson, we're going to talk about really concrete evidence for the copies of the Bible. We're going to start talking about the synagogue copies. And when did all of that start? Thank you so much for joining me for lesson 2, and I hope to see you in lesson 3.